Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Vicente LLP, the premier cannabis and psychedelics law firm. I'm Genevieve Meehan. I'm the Director of Compliance here at Vicente, and today I'm joined by two experts in the field to discuss staff training. Maureen and Chase, will you please introduce yourselves and let us know a little bit about your background?
I'm Maureen McNamara, and training has been my priority and focus since the 1900s, so for a very long time. And my training career really started in the hospitality industry. And then back in 2013, I started training folks in the cannabis industry. And it was a delight to bring decades of talent to this emerging licensed, legalized industry. And back in 2014, we created a company called Cannabis Trainers. And our primary offering is to inspire folks to know the rules and play by them. We created responsible vendor training back in 2014. When I'm not working, I am perfecting my s'more marshmallow roasting techniques, and I've got some really good insight about how to make a great s'more.
Well, that is a tough act to follow. I'm Chase Eastman. I'm the founder and CEO of Rootwurks. I've spent the better part of my career in ed tech and software, supporting training programs and compliance programs, previously in the food manufacturing world, and we jumped over here to the wonderful world of cannabis about 2 years ago, and really just got our product to market about a year ago. So still feel like the new folks in the cannabis world, but uber nerd on all things training and compliance. So really look forward to be with y'all and hear y'all's questions and talk a little bit about kind of best practices.
Thank you both. I'm so happy to have you both joining us. Now that our participants are familiar with both of your backgrounds, I'm sure they all recognize why it's important to Vicente to leverage connections with educators and systems in the cannabis space that support our clients, with both meeting and exceeding the regulatory requirements. During our work together, we often identify ways to share information and facilitate collaboration to better support our respective clients. So today, we thought it would be really valuable for all of us to engage in a live conversation on some of the common missteps that we see in training programs so that you can benefit from that collaboration too. On the next slide, I will review kind of a general overview of what we'll cover today. Both Maureen and Chase tackle training requirements from different angles. Today, we're going to have the opportunity to talk to them both about what the gold standard is for training cannabis employees, the common and costly pitfalls, how to facilitate and create a culture of compliance in your operations, and how to meet the requirements of your regulators while making the most of your training protocols. Compliance is a vital component of every aspect in the cannabis industry from seed to sale. Your employees are interfacing with a highly regulated consumer good and should be armed with an education and the resources to support each other and your business. Before we dive in further, I'm going to provide you with a quick overview of just some general requirements on training protocols. Please keep in mind that this is a high-level overview and may not address the unique needs of your company or the state where you operate. Our intention here is to give you some perspective on the wide variety of training requirements that should be considered in the cannabis industry and where it makes sense for you to be exceeding just the cannabis requirements in your state or local jurisdiction. While we're touching specifically on cannabis requirements today, I also wanted to note that we are leveraging decades of experience from both Chase and Maureen and other industries. So this collective experience is really going to inform a lot of best practices around these training requirements. On the next slide, I just wanted to call to your attention that while you develop your company's training program, you should keep your day-to-day activities based on your license type at the forefront. Essential training requirements will vary based on the licenses you hold and the number of licenses that you hold. Your retail or delivery employees may need additional training on permissible claims or customer support than your harvest technicians or your folks that are on production line, who will want to be more empowered with information on sanitation or handling practices. Keep that in mind while you develop your comprehensive internal SOPs and all of your training protocols, that you should be as custom and specific to your exact operation as possible. On the next slide, I'm hoping to give you guys some information while we provide an overview of the various requirements in states. If folks are willing to share in the chat, not the Q&A, but the chat, I'd love for you to drop in whether your materials exceed the state-specific cannabis requirements or how you're operating with your current training program. Only if you're willing to share, but if you stick to the basics of exactly what the cannabis program is calling out for you and why. We won't address these comments one by one, but we would love to see what kind of strategies you're implementing and whether or not they're working for you. Later on, we'll have more of a collaborative session where we can answer some questions for you about your specific protocols. Starting to see some things come in the chat. In many cases, I do see companies who put together training materials that exceed what is required by the state because their goal is focused more on creating top quality product or curating a very specific customer experience that meets their brand. With that in mind, I've also seen very comprehensive training programs that miss some of the most basic details for on-site safety or sanitation, such as forgetting to train a manufacturing facility on how to use a fire extinguisher. Maureen and Chase will dive in further for us on how you really create a program that meets the requirements and empowers your team, but the information that you provide, if you are willing to share, will help give us some context. As a quick overview, this slide depicts 5 key states where all 3 of us have done some work on training and education for cannabis employees. And as you can see, these requirements vary by state. There are some common themes. Seed to sale tracking, sanitation, safety are things that we see come up in every state. The cannabis regulations in each of these states often allow operators to implement a wide range of training opportunities. For instance, there's no specific overview or required training for your operational SOPs in almost any of these states. While you have a lot to accomplish to open your facility, establishing your internal training standards without the use of a pre-selected required course can create a challenge. I should also note that there are several states where there are pre-selected and required courses. An example of this is the Cal OSHA 30-hour training requirement or responsible vendor training in Massachusetts for that basic core curriculum. But even in those instances, it's still important for your managers to be informed so that they can consistently reinforce that educational training and reestablish the key requirements in the facility. With that in mind, Maureen, I'd love to turn it over to you to hear a little bit more about your experiencing with developing core curriculum, especially with responsible vendoring requirements.
Sure. So on the next slide, we'll see where responsible vendor training is required. And if you join me in the chat feature and you do a drop down where it says everyone, if you're joining me now live, or if you're listening to this recording, you can think about it. But if you have taken responsible vendor training, we call it RVT, some states it's called RVP, and then Maryland is being creative in calling it CDAT, which is Cannabis Dispensary Agent Training. So it's the kind of same thing, but it has a few different names. So go ahead and text chat in to everybody if you've taken this program. Now you can see it doesn't look like a lot of states require this, and some states incentivize this. But even in states that may not have this as required training, all right, Teresa, you've taken it, Sheila, you got it, great, is that many states like Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Alabama, Ohio, all have detailed training requirements, much of which is covered in responsible vendor training. And so for some places it's mandated and other folks it's optional. Now, one of the things to consider is if training appears to be optional in your state or your county, we do encourage you to jump in there because it's often considered a mitigating factor. That really means we're going above and beyond what the baseline is. And that can be really helpful if you find yourself or your team in any type of trouble in the future. It shows that you made an effort to really know and understand the rules. So when we think about responsible vendor training, it's one of those foundations that helps create a thriving business. So depending what's required or not, let's talk about what the gold standard is for training. And on the next slide, when you think about having a thriving business, we got to backtrack that a little bit. So if we click again, we'll notice that part of a thriving business is compliance. Now, given that our company, Cannabis Trainers, is really focused on helping people know and play by the rules, compliance for a thriving business is really critical. And all of that starts with training. So get ready. It's going to be like an entire half-day class in 4.5 minutes. When it comes to training, and I'd love to invite you to join us back in the chat feature. Again, this is a great place to banter with us during our program. You can throw questions in the Q&A. But for those of you that are with us live, in the chat feature, what do you think creates really powerful training? I'll be looking for your feedback. But I want to kind of frame this in a way that might make sense for us in the cannabis industry, which is set and setting. So when we think about the mindset for training, there's 3 people involved in this process: the manager, the learner, and the actual facilitator or trainer. Now, I've got a lot of questions for you, apparently. Which of those 3, the manager of the learner or the trainee or the facilitator, do you think is most important in training retention? It's like a little quiz in the middle of our webinar. Okay, I like what I'm seeing coming in the chat window. And so all 3 people are key in the mindset for training. For those of you that have ever needed to sit through a training that felt like a root canal would have been more enjoyable, you might have been there more as a hostage. The little known fact here is that the manager and the trainee relationship is almost more important than the facilitator themselves. So really having a setup ahead of time, and then a learner that desires to be there, and then an engaging training program. Now that's about the mindset. A second key feature is the setting. Is this training going to be happening on the job? Is it going to be self-learning? Is it classroom with facilitator? Is it classroom like Zoom, like we're doing right now with a facilitator? Or is it on-demand virtual, or a fancy way to say that is asynchronous, right? So with technology, self-paced, someone could do that learning at 2 a.m. if they desire. So all of those are really important features. Now, as we look at the chat window, all of that above, the interactivity is key. The experience and knowledge management is key. I love your ideas in here. So when we think about that, it's really that the other key element of training is what happens before the training event, the actual training event, and what happens after the training event. And not to take away from the value of what we do as a training organization, but that before and after is essential for a positive learning experience. Having a moment with the learner before they go to that training, setting expectations, creating the need, and then after the event, the manager following up and holding folks accountable to implementing what they learned. The training does not stop with the learning event itself. It's got to have that setup and that follow-up to really be impactful. But if I were to throw out a few essentials when I think about the gold standard of a training, yeah, I like what you're saying, Zoe, that accessibility, I agree. Accommodating different learning styles is essential. Does this person prefer to learn socially? Do they prefer a solo learning style? So meeting the learner where they are. And not only that, but is it visual? Is it kinesthetic? I mean, we could watch a video on trimming cannabis, but I gotta be hands-on with my shears to get my form and the correct ergonomics so that I can be successful and safe. So in all of that, I would say we always want to make sure the training is relevant for the learner. How do we cue them up properly for that? Maximum level of engagement so that people stay tuned in, and really accountability and follow-up. I might have to stress that a few times. The one final thought before we move on is somebody that is wonderful at their job does not necessarily mean they're going to be a fantastic trainer of that material, and really is a different skill set. So you might be tempted to recruit a great trimmer to be a trim trainer. It may not translate in the way we had hoped. Now, one of the key things that I mentioned before I pass the mic to Chase is how we do this training, and whether that's synchronous or asynchronous, the way that we do that. And there's a lot of technology that can support us, and Chase has a ton of information to share on that.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Maureen. Forgive me as I had my head down. You were throwing out so much stuff that I was taking some notes so I didn't forget to tie some things back in. Yeah, when we talk about technology, right, sometimes it can be a little bit daunting to dig in. It feels like it's this big decision. And so, you know, there's this idea of it can be your best friend or your worst enemy. And building on what Maureen and Jen have kind of touched on is, what is the culture of your organization, right? Within how you run your operations, and how do you want technology to play a role in that culture, right? So you get into things around learning management systems or document management systems, or learning experience platforms, which is at Rootwurks the phrase that we like to use, because being in the ed tech space, I might have some issues with the term LMS. They just deep rooted for me as an ed tech person. It doesn't feel like it does justice for what those platforms are really intended to do. But when you're thinking about implementing a training system and you're using technology as part of that, understanding these kind of core cultural components of how you want a day in the life of your staff to look like is really important, especially if you're starting from ground zero and starting your first dispensary, your first manufacturing facility. And both Jen and Maureen have touched on it. When you think about implementing a training system, the biggest thing I could share with you from a best practice perspective is that it's not a static thing. It's not we put together our training materials off of our SOPs and we trained all of our staff, and so we're compliant as far as meeting our training requirements, right? That is one step of the process. But one of the things that, as y'all know, in the cannabis industry, the frequency that regs change, the frequency that new regulations come in impact so much of what y'all have to deal with on a day-to-day, that when you think about, again, the implementation of training in the flow of work and consistent reinforcement is probably the most important thing that I would say take away from this, is that once they have their certificate of completion on whatever the training topic might be, how you reinforce that, how you build that type of accountability that we've been discussing into the day-to-day operations of your organization is significant. And both from a technology, but also from an adult learning perspective. So as Maureen touched on, meeting your staff and your team with where they are as learners, right? The other way in curriculum development is modality, right? What model of learning does your team respond the best to? Can be a very wide-ranging type of curriculum for your staff, because we all have really unique ways that we like to learn information. What's consistent across all learner types, whether you like visual or reading or hearing your training versus reading your training as common examples. Reinforcement is key to retention. Doesn't really matter which way you like to learn. That reinforcement is universal. And why is that important? There's something called the forgetting curve as we jump to the next platform. It's a general adult learning principle, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, and it ties in really nice to what Maureen was touching on earlier. Everything that we learn as adults, right? And so this is whether you're a CEO or a first day trimmer or first day bud tender. When we learn things as adults, within the first 25 minutes, we lose about 25% of that information because there's such a flood of information coming at us at all times. When you think about, most people are probably on this webinar right now, multitasking, doing 5 or 6 different things while they're listening to this webinar, right? And so that retention for adults is significantly lower than that of our counterpart children that absorb everything like a sponge. And when you extend that forgetting curve out 31 days, your employees have lost 75% of what you've trained them on. And so when you think about when nonconformities or when problems with regulatory bodies come into play, it's because most of what you've trained your staff on has been lost, and what they've replaced it with is what they see happening on a day-to-day basis around them, and they mirror behavior, right? And so when you get into the idea of reinforcement, when you're thinking about your training program, there's a term called just-in-time training or in the flow of work training. So you train the individual initially the first time, but then throughout their daily tasks, their weekly tasks, their monthly tasks, you have reinforcement built in. And that reinforcement can be in a variety of things, right? So as Maureen was saying, mixed media, blended learning, right? So you have an asynchronistic e-learning course that you want everybody to go through as part of their onboarding. Then you give them checklists that help them reinforce what they learned the first couple of times they do a task. Then you have visuals throughout your facility that can help reinforce the correct behavior. So if you like things like posters or digital displays that reinforce certain things, these are all ways that you reinforce that training, and you can use technology as ways to help automate these activities, things like learning plans. But there, with technology, there's always multiple ways that you can get anything done. So it really starts with understanding that core need and meeting the learner, and then looking at the software and evaluating around truly value add. Because if you just say, I'm just going to go get this system or that system, and you don't understand how it's going to tie in the flow of work, all it's going to really become is a distraction that your staff doesn't like logging into. They don't like getting into the system and meeting the requirements. It feels like additional work and not something that's providing value add. And your training program should be value add all day long when it comes to those employees. So with that, again, as Maureen said, entire presentations of stuff on just these slides, but really want to get to y'all's questions. So with that, we'll turn this over to Jen and let her keep us moving.
Thanks so much for that, Chase. I really appreciate your context around the forgetting curve too, because we're working in a very rapid paced industry that is also evolving at a quick pace. So the reinforcement throughout the flow of work is so important. And I think in my visits to different operational facilities and supporting teams with compliance, I do recognize that there is an increase for regulatory compliance violations or other errors on site when we're moving further away from that training reinforcement. The idea of reinforcement in the active flow of work is so important, whether it's through checklists or systems implemented by managers or direct conversation with managers who are always actively training. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think With that, I would love for us to dive into some of the common pitfalls all three of us have seen in training programs, and the errors specifically that we've seen time and time again. So if we move to the next slide, I'll kind of kick us off. Fortunately, this is something that I have seen significantly less of in recent years, but in the early days of operating in a new state with brand new staff, it was not uncommon to see regulatory compliance violations relating to selling to minors. This is an easy mistake for an employee to make. The number of IDs they're checking, whether at the point of sale or when letting someone into the facility, it's easy to make the mistake of not appropriately verifying a government-issued photo identification and inadvertently selling to a minor. In Colorado, they've actually recently published data on the underage sales dashboard. It clearly demonstrates that the trend of violations for selling to minors is on the decline, but MED in Colorado is still out and actively doing undercover ID checks with vertical IDs and occasionally finding errors. When I speak to operators about their protocols to prevent underage sales, I see a significantly higher success rate from employees who are empowered with clear training programs. They have an ID scanner available to them or an ID verification guide ready to go as soon as they're greeting people on entry to the facility. I'm wondering if, Maureen, you have any examples of errors with ID verification or other common issues you've seen that licensees need to check for.
One of the things I love that you said, Genevieve, was prevention. And we can think about training being needed to prevent pitfalls or in reaction to, oops, there was a mistake. Now do we have to train or retrain? I'll give you a story from the street on this. Whenever I cross paths with a state regulator, I'm always asking for, what are you seeing? What's going on? What mistakes? So that I can bring our clients really good, fresh details and data. A regulator said that they were doing a compliance check for sale to underage. That means either police, state regulatory, or sometimes together sends, let's say, a 19-year-old non-patient in to see if they can either enter or make a purchase at a dispensary. A 19-year-old walked up, the door person said, you have to be 21 to get in. The 19-year-old working with law enforcement just shrugged their shoulders and was like, And the door person said, all right, we're kind of slow, make it quick. Now, hopefully that shocks some of you, but one of the key things when we're talking about training is it an I didn't know, or is it a I don't care? That door person that knowingly and willingly let an underage person in might have gone through fantastic training, but they didn't care. And I don't care people are super risky. And the solution to I don't care people is to fire them, to bless and release them, send them someplace else. The I don't know people, I didn't realize, now those folks are trainable. So aside from an egregious I don't care person, some of the issues we've seen in training selling to minors or allowing these folks on site. By the way, this isn't just for dispensaries. I was working with a client at their manufacturing facility, and a 19-year-old air conditioning repair person tried to enter the facility to support a maintenance call. No can do. In most of our states, folks have to be 21 and over. But a training issue here could be simply people think, I just need to make sure this person is 21. Where a year after training, they might just be looking at the date of birth. And to Chase's point, reinforce, we need to look at more details. Is this ID valid, not expired? Is the picture and the description the same as the person in front of you? So paying attention to details is essential to avoid this type of pitfall.
Well, and just building off of that real quick, Jen, is, you hear the word culture a lot when you talk about really good training programs, and it drives a culture of safety and accountability. Maureen used that word earlier, in accountability. And so building on the example, when you think about your training program, the verification and validation protocols, right, of being present and walking your facility and doing internal audit protocols and observing behavior of both against standard operating procedures, but also against cultural behavior, right? And what that means to your organization. If you do that on a consistent basis, then your operational systems will help self-select the I don't care people out of your organization, because they're being held accountable in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable. But you do it consistently across your entire team at all times, and you just set the bar of, no, this is where the bar is. Your organization filled with awesome people that are meeting that bar will help you self-select those folks out. So when you think about that operationally, again, it's in that reinforcement and constant just consistency from that perspective.
Right. On that, I'm going to move us to the next pitfall that I have seen in multiple states. And it's not unlike ID verification, but something that I see more commonly at retail storefronts is directly tied to providing bud tenders with information and resources to do their job well, and this consistent reinforcement. Accidentally, I should say, exceeding a patient or consumer's daily sales limits. This is another area where we have those two buckets. We have the I don't care people, but then we also have folks who are honestly attempting a sales transaction without realizing that they are inadvertently exceeding daily sales limits. I guess to back up at a kind of wider range here, these requirements vary by state and are often not as straightforward as we'd like them to be. It's especially difficult when you're considering the conversion of concentrate to flower equivalencies, and you're doing this on the fly as you're checking out your patient or consumer. This was many years ago now, but I worked with a licensee who realized that their POS system, which was capturing the amount of cannabis being sold, but the conversion on the data entry was wrong. That POS was just not appropriately considering the amount of cannabis in an edible. It was only happening with one product, so this was a very small scope for the error, but with big ramifications where theoretically a sales limit could have been exceeded. This issue was actually caught through training and reinforcement by a particularly exceptional compliance person who reviewed daily sales line by line and was checking all of this data very carefully. In that instance, it was quickly remedied, and a retraining was facilitated with all employees who work at the point of sale so that they could understand the daily sales limit. And I think this is interesting too, Chase, because you're kind of speaking how technology can be your best friend. But if you're relying and not thinking critically about the technology systems that you're implementing, or fact checking, or working collaboratively with your team to verify every system that you're putting in place, can also be a real detriment. I'm curious about both of your thoughts on this, if you've seen similar examples, or how you'd recommend training staff to use their resources, especially technology resources, but also verify.
I'll jump in first.
Yeah, please.
One of the things is there can be a training event, and we think about that is that half hour, 45, or half day or full day training experience, but that's one form of training. Another form of training is a 3-minute pre-shift conversation on the job, much more casual, where a supervisor might simply quiz or ask some questions for these learners that may have, and going back to what Chase said about that forgetting curve, we get into the groove of our day-to-day and our recall, because of our attention spans, may really start to drop. And so if it's not a full training event, training can look like conversations, quizzes, questions designed to verify, recall, and all of that can be super quick, easy, on the job style. Now, the other thing I just want to mention real quick, in the spirit of compliance with the sales limit, is the looping. So it might not be a single transaction, but if Billy comes in 3 times a day, is that still within that daily sales limit? And that type of training is about alert awareness and really being committed to excellence open eyes and caring. Now, the I don't care person that no longer works for you might have just kept selling more than the limit.
That's a good point. You know, this one is such a fascinating one for me. When we were doing the due diligence and our homework before we started Rootwurks, we were interviewing as many operators, owners, managers as possible around problem statements that we thought that to validate things that we were trying to solve with our software. And one of the more fascinating ones aligns with this, where an owner would walk into they had multiple facilities, and what they would pick one question that they would ask that was timely based on what they knew the inventory was and what was going on, and they would ask that exact same question and go to each of their locations and ask the same question. And the challenge is he would always get different answers to that question that were subjective. The worst part was there was a right answer to that question that wasn't subjective. So the reason, and so when we were developing Rootwurks, that was part of that reinforcement cadence again of you just have to continue to touch your employees with the correct answer. Another way to think of this is, if you remember that game, I think it was the phone game when we were kids, where a story starts on one end of the line and you just have each person whisper the same, and you're supposed to be repeating verbatim what the story was. And then you see the scope of change between what the original story was after it goes through 20 or 30 people. That happens within your operational facilities all the time. You get the peer-to-peer learning. Oh, this person's been here for a long time. Let me just go ask them. And they regurgitate what the training was based on what they did. And you pass that down, and it's all best of intention stuff that ends up happening. And this one is uniquely challenged because every operator in the business wants to drive as much sales as possible. They want to sell as much, they want to do as much top line, while also balancing some of these complex rules that aren't always logical, but you need to understand, right? And so again, with that, I know I sound like a broken record. It's that reinforcement. And I love what Maureen said. It's a daily huddle for that shift. Or if you have multiple shifts in your facility, it's a daily shift where you're talking about the key things. Or if there's new product, you're giving updated information. And it's in consistency. And it's in that consistency of behavior that any program or any training facility or training program within a facility I've seen, it's in the consistency where you really start to differentiate yourself and become best in class, because that's, you can optimize and grow. But I acknowledge that this one in particular is a challenging one for our industry, because it's a very fine line on increasing top line while managing your responsibilities to compliance. That this is a fun one. Sorry, back to you, Jen.
I just, while Whisper Down the Alley is fresh on the mind, I want to dive into inventory labels, counts, and quality. I'm specifically thinking of examples in California and Colorado where in the earlier days of adult use sales, or very shortly after a regulatory change when it comes to your packaging and labeling, there are a wide variety of interpretations on those requirements, lending to confusion between licensees throughout the supply chain. And that your anecdote of Whisper Down the Alley and training in facilities made me realize that we're a small enough industry still, that does happen industry wide. And the frequency of changes in labeling requirements in our industry, training and packaging and labeling isn't something that you can simply check a box once a year. It requires active participation and retraining from all staff, not just the staff who is doing the final quality check, but even your marketing professionals who may be designing your initial packaging. I guess with that in mind, I would love if the participants who are live with us can hit the react button down at the bottom and react. Hit the like button if you have ever crossed paths with a label error, just so we can see kind of the scope of this issue. If it's just limited to our roles, nope, it looks like quite a few people. Okay. Retail or distribution employees receiving product from a cultivation or manufacturing seem to often be the last line of defense for confirming label accuracy and quality specifications. Maureen and Chase, how do you like to empower those employees? What systems do you recommend?
I think that keyword, first of all, thanks for all the thumbs up on that. Sounds like people have crossed paths with labels that were a no-go. The keyword that you just said that training can really support is empowerment. Once I understand the details, I can more fully play to them, exceed them. I'll give you a story from the street. It's about trust and verify. So you might have a relationship with a purveyor, a manufacturer, and their labels have always been spot on 4 years running. And we still want to trust and verify. And that means the person who's your inventory manager or doing the receiving should pay attention to the details. Here's an example. A client of ours was looking at the details, and many states have some version of a THC diamond that either must be on the label of the packaging or imprinted on edibles that are capable of receiving an imprint. So this THC diamond, they were looking at it, and the rule was that it had to be 1/4 inch in height, and the language underneath the THC diamond said contains THC or something like that. And another rule on the label was that the font has to be at least a 6 font or 1/12 of an inch in height, things like that. Well, they measured this THC diamond on the label and found that it wasn't in compliance. Now, the interesting thing here is they discovered that after this JPEG image had been made available by the state regulators that didn't realize what they were providing to manufacturers wasn't in compliance with their own rules. And this group got to look like real heroes by reaching out to their regulatory investigator to say, heads up, we realize the JPEG that you've provided to this entire statewide access isn't even compliant. So trust and verify. And that starts with detailed training where people remember the details.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. When I think about this example, like labels, whether it be the cannabis industry or whether it be the pharmaceutical or nutraceutical industry, labeling is one of the areas of non-conformance within regulatory schemas that is universally applicable and challenging. And the unfortunate part is just knowing the current regs and the state of them, as complicated as they are, and what that means for your label. And so as I think about ways that your training program, right, it helps touch this, is in, as Maureen said, the verification and validation step. And so within your organization, best practice for internal auditing or verification, and we used to call them V&V teams, right? Verification and validation teams. And it's a team of leads that consist of department leads from across your organization. And you have other department leads verify and validate things going on in other department leads departments, right? You don't have the person leading a department audit their own department, right? And the reason is, I say it all the time and my team makes fun of me, but it's like you ask the fish how the water is and they say, what water, right? You become blind to things that are around you all the time that you can look past without even realizing it. So it's really important when you're verifying your training protocols, and most importantly, that the things are being done correctly based on your training protocols. It should be a team exercise, right? It shouldn't be one person that's responsible for that. It should be leads across your organization that are using your systems and tools to come in and do what's the equivalent of like a third-party verification and validation. And if you're familiar with any of the food manufacturing schemas, that's actually how a lot of them are written, is they highly recommend third-party system verifications and validations around your safety and compliance protocols so that you get fresh eyes. And as it ties back to what Maureen was saying earlier about mitigating circumstances, when you have third-party verification, even if it's internally to your team, you're going to catch things that people just naturally forget, and then you fix them. And when you have that record of proactively finding mistakes, optimizing for those mistakes, retraining based on the learnings of those mistakes, and rinse and repeat, it goes from you getting shut down to you getting a slap on the wrist and a fine. There's significant differences when you have these type of protocols and systems in place. Again, this one is one I could talk through for a long time, so I'm just going to zip it and throw it back over to you, Jen. And
I kind of love where you dove in there too, and I just want to tie it back, especially around inventory specifically. It is so valuable to cross-train between departments internally and have different team members participate in the verification and validation of all of your systems. Many states now require corrective and preventative action plans. This is something that is from CGMP standards. However, I often recommend folks do it for any little typo, any data entry error, any little thing that has gone wrong on site that you have, as Chase said, proactively found and then optimize the solution for. A corrective and preventative action is never intended to be punitive. It's all information, it's all learning, it's a reason to retrain. It's a way to get your team level set and going all on the right systems again. So I just kind of want to echo that. And I see areas in inventory management where that's incredibly valuable. It's an opportune time when you're taking your inventory to catch and rectify any errors, spot upcoming expirations, check and double check your compliance with the current packaging and labeling requirements and whatever's in your inventory track and trace system. So thank you for all of that context. I'm going to move us along, but somewhat quickly, I will talk about sales rep and brand ambassador training. We'll move through this one relatively quickly because I do want to make sure that we have time for questions. But what I wanted to mention here is that it's important to train all of the employees working for your company, whether or not they are an employee who directly handles any cannabis product. We've talked a lot about training for excellence at retail, but not a lot about the systems that support other employees. Today, we're giving a very general overview, but you can't forget about training your accounting team or your marketing team, things like cannabis excise tax, things like advertising requirements. All of those are equally important, even though we're touching a lot on day-to-day sales tactics right now. So I'll kind of keep this one moving because I would love for us to dive in. Of course, if you have any questions specifically on sales or brand training, don't hesitate to let us know and we'll get back to you. What I'd love to do now is for us to touch on sanitation, which I know both Maureen and Chase have a lot to say on. So what I'll kick us off with is, at a high level, I can say that I don't think that I have ever left completing a third-party audit for a facility without noting at least one area of the facility where I thought sanitation could be improved upon. I may just be picky. However, in fast-paced environments, I recognize that this is hard to keep up with. And since we're focused so much today on training in your active workflow, I think this is a really important area for us to discuss.
Yeah, and one key element I'll say in this before we get to Q&A, and folks, we're about to get to Q&A, so go ahead and type in your questions. We'll be ready to support your specific questions in just a moment. One of the key things I think here, I'll just tie it back to what I said at the beginning, is what's in it for the learner. When the learner is learning about sanitation or safety, it might feel like, oh, this is like high school health class or middle school health classes, but there's so many details in here, literally could be life or death. So starting with what's in it for the learner, why this is so important, creating the learning objectives right up front, and then, of course, making it engaging. People with the best of intentions, and they don't even fall into the I don't care category, have created big issues by mixing chemicals, thinking if cleaning product 1 could do a great job, imagine what these two could do together. And it wasn't from nefarious intentions. It was because they forgot or they didn't realize And so really being thoughtful in sanitation training by creating the need, which also has to be on the job training as well.
Trying to get to the mute button fast enough for this one is what I will say about sanitation when you're in any sort of human food consumable scenario, whether it be retail or product manufacturing, it's incredibly challenging regardless of industry type. So cannabis or other food manufacturing, this is just not an easy thing to do exceptionally well. So if any of y'all have struggled with it, I just say that for you to realize you're not in that alone, because everybody has to clean their house. Well, most of us all, and I wouldn't say everyone, right? That there's probably subjective ranges of that, right? But we're all accustomed around being around some sort of cleaning solvents and chemicals that are residential grade to some capacity. So there is a very natural ability to assume. And if y'all are all familiar with what that acronym actually means, it is that, right? That's what ends up happening with sanitation. To Maureen's point of building off, it's like, let no good deed go unpunished. Like they were trying to, like, countless examples. They've spilt something in a area and ran and got something that they thought was just an appropriate cleaning solution to just clean something up, and it caused horrendous problems because of not having a familiarity with what's going on within your organization. And a lot of times it's people that are not trained for that particular section of your facility that end up inadvertently causing the problem, right? So it's one of your office staff walking through the product manufacturing facility and they kick something over accidentally and then, oh, I'll just go clean this up real quick, not knowing the general awareness kind of training. So there's so many ways that we could untangle this. With that, Jen, I'd throw it back to you so we can get some of these questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Chase. We actually haven't had many questions come in. I want to note, just, I guess, off the cuff, areas overall areas that we have seen repeat violations with, that we know can be improved upon with more detailed training, but that's probably not all that they can be improved upon with. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us individually, especially if it's something specific and sensitive to your organization that we can be supportive with. We are happy to do that. And maybe one question came in. Let me double check. What are some ways to create buy-in for compliance issues beyond it's the law and it's part of your job?
I'll jump in with that, Stella.
Perfect.
I have been teaching compliance focused classes for, well, decades, and I have seen my fair share of hostages, and hostages are there because they have to be, because it's the law, because I need to check the box. And what really makes a difference here is the supervisor or manager communicating with the learner prior to the training, not just saying you have to go because you have to. And that is about either tying it back to the company's vision, mission, and values. If one of our commitments is to professionalism, then how will this job add to that? Or even better, when you have a connection with everyone on your team, which I hope you do as a manager or supervisor, then it can be tying something that they are committed to, and then linking that to be, the word is escaping me, not a simile, but linking to like an analogy for why participating in this learning isn't just to check the box. And that really can be driven by the supervisor, which can inspire the learner.
Yeah, and building off of that, I think it's consistency in your training programs across your entire staff, right? So everybody, that means you, the supervisor, you, the manager. It's not a they versus us scenario. It's a we scenario when it comes to this. And then this might sound a little dramatic, but really hammering home the why part with some of this. And the dramatic part is when you are manufacturing and selling human consumable goods, the worst case scenario is people die. Like, and that sounds really dramatic, but it really can be that bad very quickly when it comes to undisclosed allergens or chemicals getting mixed in, or pests. We didn't even touch on pesticides and things getting included into the manufacturing process that people have bad experiences with. That is why these boring compliance mandated things and intense learning that you need to understand exist. It is so that people have wonderful experiences with the products that they're getting from your facilities and operations. And I know that sounds a bit dramatic, but really letting them understand and connecting the dots on how their role connects all the way back to a great experience for your customer, right? And then let the rest of your wonderful team self-select them out that if they don't get that at that point.
I guess with that, I'll also kind of lead us into our closing thoughts here. Again, if anyone has additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us individually. Our contact information will be on the very last slide of this PowerPoint. I kind of want to give everyone a call to action here to kind of reassess your own training and compliance programs and see where there are valuable areas for opportunity. These programs are not static. They can consistently be evolved upon and changed and updated. And I have kind of to speak back to the inquiry on how to make it not just it's the law or this is your job, is this is something that we get to do. This is an emerging industry with rapidly changing regulations, and we get to consistently be at the forefront. Another quick closing thought: if you, in the process of evaluating your current system, recognize you feel really behind, I have seen dramatic benefit from facilities calling a stand down, taking a few hours to all together as a team stop normal day-to-day function and as a group reassess all the training requirements and get everyone on the same page, from high-level executives down to your hourly part-time trimmer. Everyone being in the same room and collaborating on the training requirements does fantastic things for your culture of compliance at your facility and creates a huge team building opportunity as well. Maureen and Chase, closing thoughts from you guys?
Yeah, I would say it starts with the hiring process. Having people on the team that care are an essential part, because people that don't care, training may not fix them. So folks that care create engaging training that meets the learner where they are. Also, encourage that engagement and inspiring them to want to be part of their personal and professional development. Also, that essential part after training, accountability, follow-up. And finally, in the spirit of compliance, documentation of all the training. If it's not written down and documented, when that investigator comes to take a look, probably didn't happen. So document.
Yeah, I agree with everything that we just said. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure being with y'all. You know, Rootwurks is one of those ecosystems for y'all to take a look at if you're looking for something. We've built a lot of really cool solutions for helping train your staff and really with the reinforcement and flow of work. But there's a lot of great solutions out there. There's not one way for you to do a really effective training program. So we've touched on it some, but really meeting your staff with where they are and providing value to them. Don't forget that part about it, right? It's a two-way thing, and providing value to them is really important part of the process. And if you're authentically helping them become better versions of themselves, both as an employee, you're generally gonna have less of an issue if that can be an authentically true statement. So I would just remember that and be consistent with that across all aspects and levels of your organization. And generally the rest will take care of itself. So really appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all. And thanks again. With that, Jen, turn it back over to you.
I just want to thank both you, Chase and Maureen, for joining me in this conversation, answering my questions about best systems to implement some of these training protocols, meet and exceed requirements of regulators. If anyone who's attended today has questions, again, don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us. This information will be made available, and we will get back to you if you've got any questions.
Take care,
Thanks so
everybody.
much for the time. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Jen. Thanks, Maureen.